I was saying earlier, it's becoming a mantra, isn't it, these days? Nothing seems to work anymore. New figures show that NHS waiting lists for autism assessments have risen by 47% in a single year. Around 172,000 people in England currently waiting for a diagnosis.
Well, Chris Packham was told he had Asperger's syndrome in his 40s, and in his documentary Inside Our Autistic Minds, which won him a prestigious TV award, he spoke to other people living with autism whilst demonstrating his own hypersensitivity, a daily struggle that many people with autism encounter. And for Chris, he finds comfort in natural surroundings.
Well, we're joined by Chris. Hi, Chris. Thanks for coming in. That's fascinating insight there. Along with Kelly Burley, whose 9-year-old daughter, Nancy, is waiting for her own autism diagnosis. Hello, both. Let's talk to you, first of all. So she's 9 now.
Yes.
When did you first think, hello, she might be on the spectrum?
When she was a toddler, she had symptoms in terms of, like, tiptoe walking, what you say is more stereotypical type traits, like lining up toys, not really enjoying imaginative play. And we do have an older daughter as well who has autism, so who's diagnosed as autistic. And so we sort of knew what we were looking for.
That's really interesting. You say, like almost an obsessive lining up of things in order?
Yeah, like to do that. And tiptoe walking was mainly...
What is that? What do you mean tiptoe walking?
Oh, so walked on her tiptoes.
Walked on her tiptoes?
Yes, and ran on them. Yes, that's it, yeah.
So when did you then, if you like, go official and go for a diagnosis?
Well, we sort of saw how she went. She didn't really have any struggles at home. Yeah. And then we started school. Nancy has struggled to sort of separate from me and have those sorts of issues within school. And then in the last year, after COVID, because obviously that impacted where she wasn't even at school for some of the time. Once she's been in school full time, we've realised that there is... she needs some extra support at school, so we've asked the school to do a referral for a diagnosis.
If you're certain, as her mother, and with experience of autism, if you're certain that she is autistic, can you explain why you need a diagnosis?
So a diagnosis means for Nancy that she knows who she is. Right. She doesn't, at the moment. Imagine living when you've got, potentially got, autism, but you don't know. So you don't know why you want to watch telly upside down, or why you need to watch or do maths sitting on a peanut ball bouncing up and down. And that impacts your mental health. If you don't understand yourself, you don't know yourself, you can't look after your well-being properly. You know, it affects your friendships, your mental health. So it's really important to have a diagnosis. But also, what we have found is that having a diagnosis is not supposed to be a barrier to support. However, we've just had a recent GP appointment where it's been identified that Nancy probably does need some help sleeping, like melatonin, for example. But our GP cannot prescribe melatonin.
Without a diagnosis.
Without a diagnosis.
So there's something. And does she get extra help at school, for example, or is that another thing that she would need an official diagnosis for?
No, not necessarily an official diagnosis for. In our case, we are so lucky. We have a really supportive school that are really, really helpful. Although Nancy is not in school currently, she is unable to attend.
Why not? What's the problem?
She finds the classroom environment really, really tough. It's a sensory nightmare for her.
And do you think treatment with melatonin might help her overcome that?
So melatonin is to help sleep. So Nancy doesn't sleep particularly well. So that is definitely a barrier to attending school. It's not exclusively the reason she can't attend school. It tends to be more the sensory issues that she's struggling with in the classroom, which is now preventing her. But what happens is when you don't have a diagnosis and you don't understand somebody's sensory profile, for example, as Chris would tell you, everybody is different. Every person who is autistic is an individual. Yeah. What we're doing with the school and what we're trying is it's all trial and error. But when there's an error and we're not putting the right provisions in place for her, that's her mental health.
Yeah, so
you know, that's what you're playing with. That's what, yeah.
And how long have you been told that you will have to wait for this diagnosis?
84 weeks until it potentially...
84 weeks?
Yes, to 89 is what is currently been advised.
Well over a year.
Yeah, for an initial assessment.
Okay. So the target, they say, guidance states no one should wait longer than 13 weeks. So that's significantly longer in that case, which must be a frustrating situation. I mean, Chris, when you hear stories like this, I know obviously for you, you know, diagnosis came later in life, but what does it mean for someone having that diagnosis? What difference can it make?
Well, I can only tell you about my own experience, and obviously I'm much older, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s when the condition wasn't widely known, certainly by my parents and teachers and so on and so forth. So by the time I'd got to the beginning of my teens and certainly into the early part of my 20s, the mental health issues were quite considerable. I loathed myself. I thought that I was broken. Clearly, I was in a lesser cohort than most other people, so I blamed myself for everything that was going wrong. And young people can't be in that position if they're going to work through education and find a fulfilling life. We need to put them on a firm foundation of confidence and support. And the diagnosis should be an access to that type of support. So it's not just about getting the diagnosis, it's about what follows from that.
That's really interesting. So how old were you when you were diagnosed with Asperger's?
I didn't, well, until I was 44.
44?
And I became aware of that in the 1990s when I was dating a healthcare professional, and that was my first experience of...
And what difference did it make to you? I mean, did it, in effect, the next morning after you'd been diagnosed, did you wake up thinking, that's why? That's the explanation.
It didn't, but what's interesting is that when I know a few people that I knew when I was diagnosed, and they say that it's quite considerably changed me. I'm much more confident to talk about my needs, my incapacities, and the things that I can do better. I will put myself forward if there's something which I am unable to do by the condition, and I will be far more frank and honest about the disabling aspects of it from my point of view. So there were certain things where, you know, they would be so challenging that I would rather not confront them, and if that's in a professional context, then I would say to you here, if you were going to ask me, you wouldn't obviously, but, you know, I would say, do you know what, I'd rather not do that because it won't be good for me, it won't be good for you, it won't be good for us in terms of what we're doing.
And you feel more enabled to say that because actually you've got the diagnosis to back it up. I mean, I think
that if I have, I mean, we have I mean, this week is World Autism Acceptance Week, and what we're trying to do is say that we want to develop a society where autistic people can prosper, and that will only come if society understands what autism is about. And that's why we have these sorts of conversations. And people like myself and Kelly will speak frankly about the condition and the impacts of that so that we have that wider understanding, and the autistic community should be able to prosper.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I feel sorry for you and what you went through, and I imagine others that are in the situation where they are feeling like that and it hasn't been diagnosed, can't work out what's causing it, feel the angst, the turmoil, the mental anguish, in a sense, of not being able to understand who they are in the world. And I know, you know, people are getting in touch now saying, Katrina, for example, we waited for over 6 years for a diagnosis and only just got one. My son struggled all the way through primary and the start of high school. You know, it's just a heartbreaking situation. Another one here, Haywood, I was told I have to around 8 years to get tested. You know, there are lots of people, unfortunately, in your situation, aren't there, as well?
Anecdotally, I know people in my local area that have had that are waiting 120+ weeks. That's what I've sort of spoken about on some parent groups and parent forums. And also that some people had initial assessments, and then again, like they're like a year down the line and they've not really heard much or had follow-ups. So that 13-week turnaround is just. That's
yes, Congress.
Well, the thing is, I mean, I was given my diagnosis when I was 44 years old, so I was sort of a functional adult by that stage. I'd come to terms with some of the conditions. I'd learned to manage myself. I mean, I was working. You know, not everything was bad. For young people at the most vulnerable and formative parts of their lives, the difference between a diagnosis age 9 and a diagnosis age 12, 13, 14 is significant, because in that interim period, they will not be getting a fulfilled education. They will not be getting the social support that they need. And obviously, when you've got parents like Kelly who are devoted to understanding the condition, understanding the impacts that that's having upon their children, there's a positive support there.
Chris, just going back to that clip we showed there, I hadn't seen that programme. I found it absolutely fascinating. Just tell us a bit more. What is it about you going out into the natural world which eases your mind and, if you like, transports you into a more secure place? What is it?
Well, firstly, I normally go on my own, and I went as a child on my own. I thought I was going because everything that I was interested in, was fascinated by, lived there, all the wildlife. In fact, now what I recognise now with the benefit of hindsight is one of the reasons I was going there was to be solitary. So there was no one to compare myself with, because in those spaces, then I was normal, as it were.
Yes.
But then, of course, the sensory side of it is, well, that's one of the traits of autism, and we all experience it in different ways. For me, it's a visual thing. So I have a very acute visual sense. I see a lot of things very quickly, and the detail goes into my brain where it's remembered in that sort of hyper detail. And my sense of smell is probably more developed or is more acute, and I use it more than other people. So simple environments like going into a supermarket was really challenging as a child because you've got the smell of the fruit, the fish, the meat, all of the people and everything else. And they're all crammed into one confined space. And I would try to explain to my mother that I couldn't cope with the smell. She would just say...
What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But now, of course, young people need to be in a position where they can articulate that and people will understand.
But interestingly, the way you
overwhelming.
The way you describe it just there, you make it actually sound now that you have your diagnosis and you come to terms with it. It's almost like a gift.
Well, I always say autism, my autism, can be seen as a gift, but sometimes when you open it, you don't get what you want. You know, because there are downsides to it as well. There are things that I'm not very good at, and I have to work very hard to do them. And if I'm working hard to do them, then I'm doing two jobs at once.
What aren't you good at? What can't you do?
I'm not terribly good at socialising. I'm not very good at starting conversations. I'm quite good at engaging them with them with people. I've never asked anyone out in my entire life, I don't think. I just, you know, I was perceived as a shy boy. You know, part of my traits when I was young was I was shy because I wanted to spend time by myself and not to engage with other people. But I work in an industry like you where it's all about teamwork. We're all doing our job in a team. So I have to work with all of those other people and critically analyse how I do that to best function. And now, obviously, some of the things that I learned to do when I started in the 1980s doing the Really Wild show, I found really challenging. Now they've become habitual and they're easy. But I still have conversations with my colleagues where I will say to them, is it all right if I do it this way? Because that's going to be much easier for me and therefore it will be better for all of us.
To be able to make you feel more comfortable. So you've come to a good level of understanding. I know, Kelly, for you, obviously, you have a good level of understanding because of your older daughter. You were able to get a private diagnosis for her. But the situation's changed now, hasn't it? Why aren't you able to do that for Nancy?
The reason that we haven't at this point gone for a private diagnosis, one, cost of living crisis, the prices have nearly doubled in terms of what we paid for our elder daughter. But also, you know, as we're discussing, you know, it's not a magic diagnosis. There's the support that goes after that. So what we have found with our elder daughter is that even though she has the diagnosis, which is great, and we know her inside and out, and we know her sensory profile, brilliant. But then also what we've struggled is getting back in the system. So she may need medication for things. Now we are struggling to get the medication, and we're starting right back.
Oh, so it's still better to have
on CAM's waiting list to then, so that is the struggle that we are having. So that's why we decided to stick
I wish
down
we'd
the
had
NHS route.
better reasons to have this conversation this morning, but I'm very glad we had it. It was absolutely fascinating listening to the two of you. And Nancy, who came in with you this morning, and we gave her the option to come and sit here or not, and she decided on the whole not. But she's been operating camera 2 all the way through, haven't you, Nancy? She's behind camera 2, and she has been she's been pulling focus.
She's done a great
Brilliant.
job. So I just want to say thank you for coming in to talk about this. Thank you as well, Chris, for your insight into it, which, you know, I think will, for a lot of people as well, it's about understanding, isn't it, what's going on with people and just having greater awareness.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we've got 26% of autistic children at school not liking school. And we've got 29% of autistic people not in any form of employment whatsoever, and 70% of autistic people suffering mental health difficulties. That needs to change, and it needs to come from investment in healthcare support, basically, and that starts with diagnosis.
Yeah. Good view.
Thank you
very
both.
much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nancy. Good job.
Just to say, an NHS spokesperson said the NHS remains fully committed to supporting and improving the lives of people with autism, which is why we've published new national guidance for assessment services to ensure local areas can manage the significant increase in referrals they've seen over the last year, while ensuring people have the support they need as they wait to be assessed.
Well, if you've been affected by any of the stuff that we've been talking about here, then, as always, there's advice and support at itv.com/helplines. It's all there for you.